So, here's the thing about me. I technically haven't covered every game in the Fire Emblem series. At the start of 2018, I began a retrospective video series on my favorite video game franchise of all time, Fire Emblem. Well, it was a huge success for my channel. To everyone who shared them, gave them feedback, or just watched them in the first place, thank you, from the bottom of my heart. It was because of your combined efforts this series has reached as many people as it has. But there was always something about the video series I wasn't quite satisfied with, in retrospect. For the very first video in the series, I based my critique on the Shadow Dragon remake for Nintendo DS. In fact, I had only sampled the original Famicom version before that video was published. I didn't think much of it at the time, as my initial intention was to cover Fire Emblem 1, 2, and 3 through each game's remake, as they were the most relevant versions. But as it turned out, I had already played through Gaiden, so I could properly highlight the differences between the two versions. And I also found the time to play through Mystery of the Emblem before the third video was complete. While both of my videos for Gaiden and Mystery of the Emblem are as good as they could have possibly been, and actually some of my personal favorites, I don't think it's true to the spirit of the retrospective to analyze how the Fire Emblem series evolved when I didn't really experience where the series started. But recent developments have also made for a really good opportunity to discuss this game. In celebration of Fire Emblem's 30th anniversary, Nintendo and Intelligent Systems ported Fire Emblem 1, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light to the Nintendo Switch as a standalone game. But unique about this version is a brand new English localization. And the best part about this version is that if you're watching this video after March of 2021 and you haven't bought the game, you'll probably never be able to play it, as it was a limited release with this game's availability ending at March 31st, 2021. Did I say best? I meant worst. This is just awful. Nintendo, what the hell? Deplorable business practices aside, this is the best chance I've had since I started this video series to talk about Fire Emblem's origin. So to close out any lingering regrets, let's talk about it. If you have the ability to play this game still, should you? Our story begins many years in the past. There was once a dragon named Medeus, and he was an evil dragon. Then came Henri, who was a good human. The two battled until Medeus was slain by Henri, who used Falchion, the Blade of Light. But 100 years later, Medeus was resurrected by Garneth, the Dark Pontifex. Though Henri's descendant, the King of Altea, challenged Medeus, he was ultimately killed. Not only was Falchion stolen by the enemy, so too was the land of Altea. Though hope still remains. Altea's Prince Marth survived his kingdom's fall. Now he journeys across the continent of Arcanea, recruiting allies willing to join his cause, and free all oppressed by the Dollar Empire. The thing about the writing in Fire Emblem 1 is that it's very plain. The script is a very literal translation of the original Japanese text. There really isn't a whole lot of flavor. Character deaths happen a lot in this game, but one thing I didn't know is that personalized death quotes weren't really a thing at this point. It was also clear to me how many tall conversations were added into the remakes. Marth usually had something to say to every person that was recruited into his army. But in this game, the only lines of dialogue someone might get is their recruitment conversation, if they even had that. In fact, some of the characters in this game use the same portrait sprites, or at least a variation on an existing person. It's understandable. A Famicom cartridge only has so much space to work with. But it does have some impact on the attachment players may feel towards their armies. Not everyone feels quite as unique. Even when playing the remakes, I thought the story pacing of Shadow Dragon was pretty awkward. Sometimes too slow, sometimes too fast, not feeling like there was an organic shift in setting, the whole works. But this is an issue that's only more pronounced in the original release. This is the only game in the series that doesn't feature an in-game map that shows the geographical difference between two chapters. With almost no downtime between ending and starting a new chapter, it doesn't feel like there's much of a journey taking place. Frankly, there's just not a whole lot to say about Fire Emblem 1's narrative, especially when I've talked about it before. I at least want to give the game points for feeling somewhat cohesive though. It doesn't really feel like there's any filler in this game, even though there definitely is. The story only appears at the beginning or the end of chapters, but it's enough to establish the battle and confirm where the army needs to go next. Considering many other RPGs around this time had the expectation that players would explore the world and get lost within it, Fire Emblem knows it can remain focused. Bottom line, the story is adequate, but not the recommended way to experience the narrative of Shadow Dragon. But you're probably more interested in hearing about how the game holds up today, and if that's the case, well, Fire Emblem 1 is very primitive. At the time, reviewers called this game slow and clunky. Especially with age against it, coming back only makes its shortcomings more apparent. You know how there's that button that will quickly select the next unused unit in your queue? Not even that feature was present. That's how primitive this game is. No weapons triangle, no support system, no pants. While charming in its own right, there is a lot of obtuse design that does make this game difficult to come back to without the right mindset. Thankfully, the fundamental interactions are easy enough to grasp. Just press your fancy A button on any blue units and guide them to your desired spot on the map. While navigating around the various menus can take some getting used to, in general, it's simple enough to understand. Putting units next to each other will allow for combat to begin. The attacker makes the first strike, while the opponent makes their counterattack. If one of the combatants had a higher attack speed, they would be able to attack an additional time in the same round. But it was difficult to know exactly how battles would play out. The battle forecast was not introduced until Fire Emblem 4, improved with Fire Emblem 5, and perfected in Fire Emblem 6. Even in battle, clear numbers aren't displayed, but rather these vague bar graphs that were nearly impossible to decipher exact information from. This might have been an intelligent system's way of trying to simplify the concept, and I respect that angle if true. But specific information is ultimately more valuable. If you ever want to know the exact results of a battle, it will require doing calculations yourself. A long, tedious process that requires referencing information not present within the actual game. After playing long enough, you eventually get a feel for how certain characters are, but this requires a lot of trial and error. While the weapons triangle wasn't a feature that would be introduced until Fire Emblem 4, each weapon type had their own features. Swords were highly accurate and light enough to easily double attack, but were very weak weapons. Axes were for high damage, but were much harder to land hits with. Lances were the middle ground between them. Bows could only attack from 2 spaces away, which meant the people who wielded them usually didn't receive counterattacks. As an additional perk, bows also had inherent built-in damage against flyers. There were only 2 weapon types in the original version that had different properties, and not by all that much. Magic tomes dealt damage only based on the might value of the spell, as a proper magic stat wasn't implemented yet, and every unit had 0 resistance. Dragonstones had unlimited weapon durability, and raised certain stats to make up for Manikeet's low bases and growths. Disregarding the balancing tweaks from later games in the series, this would be the framework for how each weapon type is balanced still. So it's fascinating they had the concept fleshed out this much. It's not really in direct combat where things were different in Fire Emblem 1. There were many smaller quirks in the overworld that played a different part in the play experience. These small quirks may cause players to learn, and sometimes unlearn, how to play games in this series. Since we were already talking about weapon types, let's go over the various weapon tiers. Every unit had a weapon level statistic, which was a stat that would increase like any other during level ups. In order to use higher tier weapons such as steel and silver, they needed to pass a certain weapon level threshold. If I have a criticism of this system though, it would be that you really don't need all that high of a weapon level to use some powerful stuff. If someone has a weapon level of 8 or more, they're more than serviceable as a unit. And at least in my experience, weapon level is the stat that increases the most frequently. Experience distribution also worked much differently than it would in newer entries. When attacking a foe normally, characters would gain experience equivalent to the damage they dealt, capping out at 20 experience per round of combat. When killing an enemy, they would give experience points equal to the experience value on their stat sheet. What about classes like the Cleric that have no means of attacking? If a non-combat unit manages to survive a round of combat, they will gain experience equivalent to the attacking enemy's value. Why this is a bad system though is because it isn't fair. The rich get richer and the units that desperately need the increased stats the most fight an uphill battle as they grow at the same rate as strong units, but need to be directly catered to in order to have hope of catching up. Inventory management was the worst aspect of Fire Emblem 1. Trading wasn't really a thing at this point. Units could only give an item to another character, an action which cost them their turn. This was only compounded by the issue that characters had 4 item slots, a very small number that fills up quicker than one might realize. Obviously, any excess items were sent to the convoy, but even that had a system unique to Fire Emblem 1. In addition to the shop and armory, the convoy was another store. There were 40 slots in total, and every item dropped off also had a deposit fee of 10 gold. This was an interesting idea, but in a way, it also discouraged storing items away, as players would not only have to pay money, but also go out of their way to retrieve their assets. And another cherry on top of this already tart sundae is not having a way to sell items in this game. So if you have a resource, you either use it or waste it. The preparation screen also provided no help in this conundrum. Items could only be shifted around on the battlefield. At worst, this means you're deploying someone that you don't want to. But always will the first turn usually be trading around items like their baseball cards. What's interesting is that maps seem to be designed with this in mind. There usually aren't any enemies within range on the first turn in almost every map of the game. I don't know with 100% certainty if this was to count for item trading, but it would make sense if that's the case. But just because something is designed around, that doesn't necessarily make it a good idea. While I will offer some forgiveness in the fact that this was the first Fire Emblem game and they were probably just trying to figure this out, an issue is still an issue regardless. The modern convoy system pioneered by Mystery of the Emblem is an innovation that Fire Emblem should never look back from. Thankfully, Fire Emblem 1 is not a super difficult game. You can complete it even without knowing every small facet of it. This even came about in ways that made no sense. The enemy AI will almost always try to prioritize forcing the player into a game over state. Therefore, if an enemy is in range of Marth and has the ability to attack him, they will almost always do so without fail. This sounds like it would make the game incredibly awful to play, until you soon realize that Marth is incredibly powerful. And since nearly every enemy attacks him, Marth will likely see the most combat, naturally funneling him the most experience in the game. Give him a few stat boosters in the areas he's lacking, and what you've created is a near indestructible killing machine. Having this knowledge, the enemy AI becomes extremely exploitable. If, for example, you need to divert enemies away from attacking a unit on the verge of death, quickly send in Marth to instantly absorb the enemy aggro, saving everyone's lives in the process. If you have a problem in general, sending Marth to deal with it is far from the worst idea you have. But the thing about game design quirks is they can be worked around. They can be planned for, they can even be used to your advantage. But what about the core game design, the maps, and the challenge? How does that fare in the original? Surprisingly well, if you can believe it. By and large, the maps in this game are really good. Playing it this time provided a lot of insight to the way these chapters operate. The level designers clearly knew the kind of experiences they wanted to deliver to players. The use of enemy diversity is a really clever tactic to build challenge in this game. The early game opposition consists primarily of axe fighters and archers, enemies that are inaccurate or can't directly counterattack. By the endgame, those axes are swapped for lances and swords, and the infantry have found some horses and wyverns to ride. The rise in difficulty feels organic because of this. You're not necessarily fighting more enemies, but stronger and better equipped ones. It's smart design that should not go unappreciated. Even early on, the game also instills many different habits in the players. In the first map of the game, it's established that thieves can destroy villages, and a submission of the chapter is to stop the thief from reaching the other 2 villages. Visiting villages is rewarding and should be prioritized. The game also gives a wide variety of starting classes that have unique advantages in traversal and combat. The game doesn't have a proper tutorial, but the game design will teach by example. There's even Famicom era logic to account for that lends credence to some decisions. Chapter 13 was one of my least favorite chapters in the remake. It just never felt like there was a good way to approach any of the rows since ballista range is so wide. In the original game, ballistas only shot 2 squares away. While this means your own ballisticians are nearly worthless, the map made more sense without the future game's logic retroactively applied to it. But that's not to say the difficulty was always well handled. This game gets brutal after passing chapter 20 or so. This is to say nothing of the final chapter in the game. This unkind abomination separates Marth's army into 4 separate groups, and without the ability to manually decide where they appear, one or more units could potentially end up dying. But perhaps death is only an inconvenience nowadays. We have a version released for the Nintendo Switch to talk about. Included in this game are quality of life improvements that make playing this game a little more palatable to newer fans of the series. It's pretty standard stuff. Things like screen sizing options, making save states, and the ability to speed up the game, but this is worse than it actually sounds. But perhaps most important of all, there is the turn rewind feature based on Milla's turn wheel. It can reset progress as far back as 20 turns prior. An interesting thing to note is that it only rewinds back to the beginning of the player phase. I actually prefer this limiting of what actions players can rewind down to the turn. It discourages just abusing the feature and encourages playing through smaller mistakes. If it weren't for the fact that players are given unlimited uses of the rewind, this would be my ideal version of the rewind mechanic in the series. Although it might be for the best that the people who have never played Fire Emblem 1 before are given as much leeway as possible. Which begs the question then, is Fire Emblem 1 worth playing in the modern year? Truth be told, I think it is. Kind of. Now, I am not recommending this game over Fire Emblem 3 Book 1 or Fire Emblem 11. If you're playing Fire Emblem 1, I hope you realize that it's Fire Emblem 1. This game is not for the faint of heart. The Famicom severely limited its potential. Age hasn't been kind to this game. It's clear to see why the team took a radically different approach for Fire Emblem Gaiden, and it's also understandable why this game was so quickly remade only 4 years after the initial release. Fire Emblem 1, perhaps to no one's surprise, is not the definitive way to experience the story of Marth's humble beginnings. But that being said, this is a viable way to experience it. There is value in playing the original version, and not purely for historical value. Strip away every innovation that Fire Emblem has made over the last 30 years, and what you get is the foundation. And what's amazing about this is by peeling back all those layers of fluff, the core essence of Fire Emblem is still demonstrated. After playing this game through the original release, I realized how little credit I used to give it. Not only did I foster appreciation for the Famicom game, but the 2 remakes it's received, as well as the entire series in general. A long time ago, I made a video guide discussing where to start if you're interested in the Fire Emblem series. And one of my suggestions to newcomers was in fact Fire Emblem 1. Having finished the game now, I still stand by what I originally said. This is one of the best places to begin the series even if you haven't played a Fire Emblem game before, but only if you understand what game you're getting into. The thing about Fire Emblem 1 is that while primitive, slow, and lacking in features, it is not any less of a worthy entry in this series. If you were to ask me what defines a Fire Emblem game, it would be this. Every choice is impactful. The choice of which units you bring into battle, the choice of where you position units in that battle, the choice of items you purchase from a shop, the choice you make when attempting to save someone's life. Every entry is filled with these moments of decision, and it's perhaps in Fire Emblem 1 where that philosophy is most proudly on display. As for myself, I'm very glad to say that I finally played Fire Emblem 1. Absolutely, it is probably the weakest entry in the series. But that doesn't have to be a point of criticism. What matters most is not if a game is outdated, or has a definitive version existing elsewhere in the series. Rather, it should be evaluated based on its own merits. If you ever want to be reminded how good this series is, play Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light. And that is it! No more bits, no more deviations, no nothing. The next time this video series will continue, it'll actually be for the next mainline entry in the series to get released. So that is it. No more worrying about anything until then. Well, I mean, unless I talk about the spin-offs.